Angelina van Dyke and I recently presented a paper entitled A Cognitive Meta-Theory that Integrates TESOL and Christianity at the CELT 2014 conference in Portland. A video of the presentation was made and has been posted on YouTube. While we were given 105 minutes to make the presentation and took 2 hours, there is a lot of material, and so I would like to do a supplementary recording here that adds more details and takes more time. The main question that I encountered at the presentation is, why? Why present a cognitive meta-theory? And why about Christianity and TESOL? What's the reasoning? Therefore, I'd like to start by addressing that question. I have been doing research for several decades in the area of cognitive modeling. Started with a system of cognitive styles, mapped that onto neurology, used that to look at personality and psychology. And once I had a theory of the mind, I then asked a computer programming question. How do you program this computer, this human computer, so that all of it works together? It's the same sort of question that one asks with any computer. When I was looking at that, Christianity started to appear as a byproduct. Similarly, my initial goal was not to explain TESOL. Instead, the application to TESOL emerged as a byproduct. In both cases, the goal of becoming mentally whole ended up leading to these other topics as a byproduct. In terms of Christianity, I suggest that the process of becoming mentally whole corresponds to Christian doctrine and the path of Christian growth. Similarly, TESOL is an unusual specialization in that it is a general specialization. It deals with all of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, both technical and non-technical, in a natural environment, not in a specialized environment. So you have something in both cases that's working with mental wholeness. There are more parallels between Christianity and TESOL. Christianity is based ultimately in theology, words, and thinking. Similarly, the goal of TESOL is to teach a language using words to communicate. In both cases, the audience is not a specialized group of experts, as is normally the case in other fields. Instead, average people are being taught to speak a new language, and to have a new way of thinking. Similarly, the focus is not upon empirical evidence, but rather on a new way of thinking and speaking. So what is being addressed is the average individual, and what is being changed is the way he or she mentally interprets information. In both cases, the goal is to open up the person to a new or different culture as a result of gaining understanding. Not just a little bit of understanding, but understanding that ties everything together, so that a person in TESOL can understand all the communication of a language. So that, similarly, in Christianity, one approaches life from a completely different perspective. In both cases, there is also a new sense of personal identity. Christianity says that a person is new in Christ, that there is a transformation. Likewise, when one learns a new language, this has a major impact upon personal identity. Going further, I suggest that both Christianity and TESOL will deconstruct if the understanding of the field itself is lacking. The content deals with global understanding and changing culture. But what happens if the field itself does not have a theory of how one should do this? Then you have the tool having less structure than the content. It's like someone trying to teach critical thinking using an approach of rote learning. In other words, how can you teach understanding if you doubt the very existence of understanding? Historically, both of these have assumed the existence of theory, have assumed that people believe that theory exists. In the case of Christianity, there has been an assumption of theology. In the case of TESOL, there has been an assumption of grammar and language structure. And the focus has been upon pragmatics. For Christianity, how does one transform the person? How does one gain converts? How does one spread the message? In TESOL, how does one teach people how to speak English? How does one apply this in real life? However, this underlying assumption is no longer present in the postmodern era. In other words, the foundation has been kicked out from under Christianity, and the foundation has been kicked out from under TESOL. What happens then is that the field itself must provide this understanding, because the understanding no longer comes from outside the field, because postmodern thinking has caused this understanding to come into question. That means that theology in Christianity has to have a theory for theology, and that you have to have a theory of TESOL. Something has to hold the field together from itself. Two things. First of all, because we are looking at a theory of a theory, what is needed is something that is self-reflective. This is talked about a lot in postmodern thought, about the ability to reflect upon what one is doing, to think about thinking. We talk about it a lot, but generally speaking, my experience is that when one analyzes these various postmodern theories, they don't hold up very well when one applies the theory to itself. Therefore, part of my goal has been to come up with a theory of personality, a theory of Christianity and TESOL that can apply to itself, that doesn't deconstruct itself. When you are dealing with a theory, this is the second thing. A theory ties together many different elements. We will look at this in more detail later on. That means that in order to prove that a theory is accurate, one has to look at many different elements and see how they relate, how they connect. That is why we will go through so many different topics. When the focus is upon pragmatics, as TESOL and Christianity tend, especially North American Protestant Christianity, the focus there has been upon pragmatics. How can one apply the message? How can one share the message? Then this will seem like a waste of time to look at all these different elements and simply try to relate them together. However, the goal is not to apply the theory. That comes later. First, one must prove the theory. One has to rebuild an inherent internal foundation for these two fields. Then one can worry about application. Because if one does not build an adequate theory, then there will be nothing left. The fields will have deconstructed themselves, and there will be nothing to teach, no reason to teach. So that is why we are looking at a meta-theory. And like I said, a pragmatic focus will tend to see this as useless, but before a theory can be applied, it must first be proven. Let us look now at the type of theory that we will be presenting. First of all, it is a meta-theory. That means that it integrates other theories. Instead of saying my theory is right and every other theory is wrong, the goal is to bridge other theories, to explain them, to build connections between them, to see other theories as pieces in the overall puzzle, and to try to put them together to fit the big picture. This can provide a theoretical unity for TESOL, also for Christianity. So meta, it's like a overall theory, a theory of theories. Cognitive. The theory that we will be using, which I call the theory of mental symmetry, looks at mental modules in the mind, cognitive modules, each module corresponding to a certain region of the brain. We will look at that correspondence. And these modules are interacting. And it is this interaction that provides intelligence. We will interpret both Christianity and TESOL in terms of different modules, how they function, and how they interact. Third, we will look at cognitive mechanisms. How do these various modules function? How do they work? How does the mind function? The goal here is not just to describe how the mind functions. Pragmatic research can do that. It observes how the mind works. It observes how people function, how they think. But that only tells us about the part of the mental iceberg that is above the water. It does not tell us how the mind could function. And that is very important for both Christianity and TESOL, because the focus of Christianity is personal transformation. Not just to describe how the mind functions, but to make it function better in a more whole manner. Similarly, TESOL deals with the entire mind, and it looks at a transformation where one goes from using one language to another language, from living within one culture to living within another culture. In order to understand this transformation, one has to go beyond simple empirical research to a more cognitive approach. How could the mind work? Not just how does it work? This does not mean that empirical research is wrong, rather that it provides part of the puzzle and that one must go beyond this. How does one go beyond this? We will be using analogical thinking. We will be looking for common patterns, similarities between one way of functioning in one area and how the mind functions in a different area. Analogy and metaphor plays a major role in linguistics, and that has become increasingly clear. We will be looking at research, teaching, identity, culture, theology, and Christian transformation, personal transformation, looking for common patterns. The theory of mental symmetry has also been applied to other areas, such as the philosophy of science, or logic, or computer programming. Also have tried to look a little bit at history, looked at much more generally at Christianity. So even though we are tying together many things here, there are still other aspects that one could mention. The model is called the mental symmetry model. Ties together many fields. Each field provides some evidence. When you're doing empirical research, then it is easy to prove something because one looks for statistical evidence. How does one prove a theory that looks at invisible cognitive data? One looks, as I mentioned, for corroborative evidence. Can one see the similar mental pattern being discussed or described in one field and as in another field? When people who don't talk to each other, people from different fields, come up with similar information, similar conclusions, then this provides significant evidence that one is dealing with underlying cognitive mechanisms, that both fields are describing the same mind. Now, we need to start this with an apology. Paradigm shifts are messy. We will look later at Thomas Kuhn and his description of paradigms and paradigm shifts. Someone has defined a paradigm shift as taking the same bundle of sticks and picking them up from the other end. The facts do not change, but they are interpreted in a different way. The bricks are the same, but they are assembled into a different structure. As we will see, a paradigm shift involves emotions, and changing paradigms is rather hard. It became quite clear to us in the presentation at Multnomah that we were describing a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching information, a paradigm shift. And that is hard to wrap one's head around. This presentation is not just one new paradigm, but we are looking at a double paradigm shift, a new way of looking at TESOL, as well as a new way of observing and describing Christianity. Again, the paradigm shift does not change the content. The goal is not to question the content of TESOL, and the goal is not to change Christian doctrine, but rather the goal is to package this same information in a different way, because that is the sort of understanding that is needed to hold these fields together. Why is it necessary to do a double paradigm shift? Because I suggest that anything less will be overcome by the steamroller of entrenched scientism. There's a strong emphasis these days upon scientific evidence, an empirical approach. That can tell us a lot about the physical world. It works very well when examining the physical world. But both TESOL and Christianity deal with cognitive issues, changing the way a person thinks and approaches normal life inside. And for that, you need a new way of thinking. And an empirical approach will not be sufficient. If you don't have a theory, then what will happen is other paradigms, other theories will come in and take the place of the theory. Even if these substitute theories are inadequate, they will be used because they're better than nothing. Thomas Kuhn has said that a scientist has to have a theory. He cannot live without a theory. Let's start by looking at the correspondence between mental symmetry and brain regions. As I mentioned, the theory of mental symmetry started with a system of cognitive styles, a way of dividing people up into different categories. This system uses 7 different types of people. And these 7 categories are divided into 2 subcategories. 4 are called the simple styles, and 3 are called the composite styles. The simple styles work with information, and they appear to emphasize processing that is occurring in the cortex of the brain, the outer region. Cortex means bark. The 3 composite styles that we will examine in a moment combine the thinking of the simple styles, and they appear to use primarily cortical processing. They take the same information that's used by the simple styles, but interpret and use this information in a different manner. Looking very briefly at a description of the 4 simple styles, they are called mercy, teacher, perceiver, and server. These terms are not original with us, and I realize that mercy is grammatically different than either teacher, perceiver, or server. I'm sorry, but these terms are not original with us, as we will see in a moment. The mercy person is associated with the right inferior cortex. That part of the brain works with experiences, emotions, and personal identity. So when you're dealing with identity, then you're dealing with mercy thought. Mercy thought remembers experiences. Each experience is given an emotional label. We get these experiences with their labels from the physical world, from living in a physical body. We will look at that in a moment. Teacher thought is associated with left inferior cortex. Teacher thought works with words and uses these words to construct general theories. We talked about theories before, and when one is talking about theories, one is dealing with teacher thought and how teacher thought functions. In both of these cases, mental symmetry suggests that there is a part in the back of the brain, in the posterior, that stores information, in this case in the temporal lobes. There is a section in the front of the brain, in this case primarily the orbital frontal region, that stores an inner world of information, dealing with identity and understanding in this case, and a processor similar to a computer processor that interprets emotional information. There is such a processor in the brain. There are 2 of them, one in each temporal lobe, called the amygdala. Moving now from inferior cortex to superior or top cortex, the perceiver uses superior right cortex. Perceiver looks for connections that are spatial connections primarily. How one thing relates to another. So you have facts. A fact is pieces of information that are connected together. An object ties together various pieces of matter. Like, for example, a knife has a blade and a handle. So those 2 pieces belong together, and that's what perceiver thought looks for. Connections, facts, objects. A map is a relationship between many places, many things. You can have concrete maps, you can have abstract maps. That is what perceiver thought is looking for. Server thought is associated with left superior cortex. Perceiver thought looks primarily at connections. Server thought deals with sequences and performs actions. If you look at the brain, the right parietal region handles maps and facts and connections. The left parietal region, which is the back, handles physical actions. If you get a lesion there, you have problems performing sequences of actions. Again, there appears to be a part in the back, in this case the parietal lobe, that stores the information, and a part in the front of the brain which contains an internal world of information. In this case, primarily in the dorsolateral region. The processor, I suggest, is the hippocampus. There is a left hippocampus and a right hippocampus. Moving further. We are looking at two different ways of approaching cognitive modules. First of all, our research began with cognitive styles, in which each name describes a type of person. For example, there is a mercy person or a teacher person. I happen to be a perceiver person. The traits for each of these persons, each of these cognitive styles, came from observing various people. And my Lorin Friesen, my older brother, did the initial research from reading and analyzing biographies and from giving seminars. That gave us a list of how each of the 7 cognitive styles think. So here you are looking at a label applied to a person. Now, how would that label compare with, say, other systems such as Myers-Briggs? Myers-Briggs and other similar systems are looking at what is functioning in the mind, whereas we are trying to look more at what part of the mind is a person living in. And that brings us to the second interpretation. You have a perceiver person, for instance. You also have a perceiver part of the mind, the right superior cortex. So you can talk about a perceiver part, perceiver thought, or a perceiver person. Obviously, every person has the same brain. Every normal person. Every person has all 7 modules. It appears that each cognitive style lives in one of the 7 modules. They are conscious in a certain module. For example, as a perceiver person, I have all 7 parts. However, 6 of them are subconscious in my mind, whereas perceiver thought is conscious. Conscious means that I can see what is happening in that form of thought, that aspect of thought. I can control what is happening in that aspect of thought. The other modes can function, but they function autonomously, subconsciously. It is more difficult to get them to operate. It is also difficult to see what is happening within them as they are functioning. But the goal for every person is still to become mentally whole. So I, for instance, as a perceiver person, my goal is to get all 7 of my cognitive modules to function together in harmony, to reach mental wholeness. And that is one reason why we need each other. For instance, if I want to get my facilitator part to function, one effective method is to work together or spend time together with a facilitator person, because facilitator thought is natural to a facilitator person, just as perceiver thought is natural to me. Therefore, by spending time with that person, I will naturally develop that mode of thought. Again, comparing this with Myers-Briggs, other systems of cognitive styles look at what mental modules, what ways of thinking are functioning in the mind, what is running, whereas the goal of mental symmetry is to look at to determine which cognitive module is conscious, which may not be the one that is running the most. For example, I am conscious in perceiver thought. However, my mother is a mercy person. Therefore, when I was growing up, my mother made sure that my mercy part functioned adequately, even though that is not me. Therefore, taking a standard test, pick out that I would tend to have some mercy traits. However, that is not because I live there, rather because that part of my mind was programmed. Similarly, the American culture contains a strong focus upon contributor thought. Therefore, that module will tend to function whether it is conscious or not. This means that it is more difficult to find out a person's cognitive style as opposed to finding out, say, a Myers-Briggs category, because you have to look past what is functioning in order to try to find out what is conscious. How does this compare with Myers-Briggs? I suggest that the basic categories of thinking and feeling correspond with perceiver and mercy. Thinking is perceiver thought, factual thought, without mercy thought. It is facts without feelings. Whereas Myers-Briggs feeling is mercy thought without perceiver thought, feelings without facts. It is natural, we shall see later, for these two to become separated from each other. The goal, if one wants to reach mental wholeness, is to have these two function together in harmony. Looking at the left hemisphere, I suggest that sensing and intuition, those are the Myers-Briggs categories, sensing corresponds with server thought without teacher thought. Actions and sequences and real-life sequencing without theory. And intuition tends to correspond to teacher thought without server thought. Looking at understanding, but jumping from here to there without taking regard for real-world sequences. Again, we see that Myers-Briggs is describing something accurately, but it is looking more at divisions rather than integration. Now let us look at what I call the diagram of mental symmetry. This is the general model that ties everything together. Notice that we have looked at two ways of processing. Analytical, you will see that on the left there, which corresponds with left hemisphere processing, and dissociative, which deals primarily with space, right hemisphere processing, there's the mercy and the perceiver. So, two ways of thinking, two ways of processing. Analytical deals with sequence, with structure, with order, how things fits together, one thing at a time. Associative tends to be more sensitive to what is out of place, looks at specific situations, looks at spatial relationships, tends to associate between one thing and another. Then looking at the left axis, there is emotion and confidence, two ways of labeling information. Emotion feels good, feels bad. We all know about mercy emotion, which adds emotions of pleasure or displeasure to experiences. For example, ice cream tastes good, cod liver oil tastes bad. However, I suggest that there is also a left hemisphere emotion that deals with understanding. It feels good when things fit together, when you have a general theory that brings order to all the complexity. It feels bad when things do not fit together. So that's emotion, left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Then there are two mental circuits. Confidence. Confidence does not just mean I feel good about how everything is running, though there is that aspect as well, especially with the contributor person. Rather, it is a certainty about information. How certain am I that a certain sequence is correct? That's server confidence. How do I know that it works in this order? How do I know whether facts fit together? That's perceiver confidence. Am I certain that this fact is correct or that other fact is incorrect? That's confidence. It's a certainty about information. Now looking at the two mental circuits, which are the diagonals, there is concrete thought. Server works with the real world, providing actions, doing movement, doing things to apply within the real world. Mercy thought works with experiences and emotions, again, from the real world. The real world is structured in such a way that server and mercy thought naturally interact with the environment. And that's why concrete thought is concrete. In contrast, abstract thought does not deal with the real world, but rather deals with words and facts that lie behind the physical world, behind the external. Teacher thought works with words, remember? Perceiver thought handles facts. Words and meanings. Teacher words, perceiver meanings. That's what handles those are the two primary aspects of abstract thought. Finally, there are two kinds of modules. The simple ones, teacher, server, mercy, and perceiver. We have just looked at those. We will then look at the composite ones, exhorter, contributor, and facilitator. You will notice that exhorter is a combination of teacher and mercy. This means that what the exhorter person and exhorter thought requires is a combination of teacher theory and personal experience. For instance, this means that the mercy person wants emotional experiences. For the exhorter, he will come up with a theory based upon the experience, going from mercy to teacher. The teacher person wants a general theory. The exhorter wants a theory that applies to real life, adding emotional mercy experiences to teacher theories. Looking now at the contributor, server and perceiver, combines not just actions, which is what the server focuses on, but also facts, which is what the perceiver thought looks at. We'll look at that in a moment. And facilitator thought, we will see in a moment, balances the thinking of the entire mind. These 7 terms, as I mentioned, are not original and with us. In fact, the original source is a list of spiritual gifts described in Romans chapter 12. That chapter begins with the phrase, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And the entire context of that passage focuses upon thinking, different thinking styles, and mental transformation, which is consistent with the application. As I mentioned, Lorin Friesen, my older brother, analyzed 200 biographies and came up with a list of traits. So that is where our initial information comes from. About the same time, Don and Katie Fortune started teaching seminars using this same system of 7 cognitive styles based in Romans 12. They have been giving seminars for 30 years, and they have sold at least 1/3 books describing these 7 different kinds of people. And I should mention that we have not done any research together with Don and Katie Fortune. All of the work has been independent. I first met them about 2010, I'm guessing, around there. And I have gone through the 3 books that they have written, and the traits that we discovered by looking at biographies and by giving seminars are about 90%, 95% the same as the traits that they discovered looking by giving seminars. Therefore, we are looking at an example of independent corroboration. 2 groups, 2 people working totally independent and coming up with similar traits. The main difference between our traits and theirs, there are 2 primary differences. First of all, their description of the teacher person corresponds to what we call the intellectual contributor. I should mention that teacher thought is unusual, and that I have not encountered very many systems, psychological systems, that describe teacher thought. My brother found 2 biographies, 2 historical figures that use teacher thought, Newton and Einstein. And I recently went through a book that described and analyzed Einstein's description of how he thought. And it corresponds quite closely to how we think that teacher thought functions. So that's the one difference. And teacher thought is difficult to work out. Second difference is their description of the perceiver person corresponds primarily to what I would call the fundamentalist perceiver person, the one who lives in an atmosphere of revealed truth. That type of perceiver tends to be a black and white thinker, can be quite judgmental, and that is the primary description that Don and Katie Fortune give the perceiver person, because their research has been done primarily in a Christian context. This makes sense because the original source of spiritual gifts comes from the Bible. In contrast, we have attempted to look beyond simply the religious context to use this as a universal theory. Finally, looking briefly at some of the neurological connections between mental symmetry, behind mental symmetry, here are some relevant papers. And the more detailed references are in the final pages of the PowerPoint. Stossen-Levine, number 1, looking at the difference between the dorsolateral frontal and the ventromedial frontal. There you find the difference between the internal world of the perceiver in the right, the server in the left, and compared with the internal world of the teacher and the mercy. Teacher in the left, mercy in the right. I should mention that it's a little difficult to do. One problem with comparing our research with neurological research is that neurological research tends to ignore distinctions between left and right hemispheres. So it will talk about dorsolateral frontal as a combined region without making distinctions between left dorsolateral and right dorsolateral frontal. This is beginning to change now with better imaging tools, and the new data that does distinguish between left and right regions appears to be consistent with the descriptions of cognitive styles. So, number 1 looks at the distinction between perceiver and server on the one hand and teacher and mercy on the other hand in the internal worlds. Number 2, orbital frontal, that describes the connection between mercy and teacher thought in the front, how it relates to emotions, and how that connects with identity. Self-image is the picture that one has of oneself. And that is what reference 3 looks at. The medial frontal cortex is in between the orbital frontal cortex, which handles mercy and teacher, and the dorsolateral, which handles perceiver and server. Self-image is like perceiver looking at mercy. Now, there is also, I should mention, an aspect of self-image that can be left hemisphere, where you have not the facts about yourself, but you know what you can do and how that fits into the general plan. We will not be talking about that form of self-image here. It is a secondary form of self-image. However, I just want to mention that that exists. Reference 4 looks at the difference between the simple styles, mercy and teacher, which has to do with emotion, and exhorter thought, the composite style that ties together mercy and teacher, which provides the drive for the mind. So emotion and drive, those, as we will see, those are different. Reference 5 looks at the difference between the information for the teacher in the left temporal lobe and the information for the mercy in the right temporal lobe. Reference 6, groundbreaking work by Damasio, in which he attempts to tie together a lot of neurology in order to describe how a sense of identity can be formed by the brain. A lot of good research there. The focus there is on the ventromedial frontal, which is another way of saying the general area around the orbital frontal. And so that again relates to orbital frontal connected with personal identity. Damasio suggests that all of identity can be explained using a scientism bias, that everything is described by brain and that there is no such thing as mind, that mind is simply an expression of the brain. I am not convinced. Looking at his evidence, I think he describes very well how the various fragments of the brain interact, but he goes only as far as saying that personal identity emerges when different parts of the brain light up at the same time. I would suggest that is like saying that if one knows what lights and instruments are working on a car and how different lights go on at the same time, that can explain the driver of the car. I suggest instead that the mind, there is a physical, a non-physical part. We're dealing now with the problem of hard consciousness, the question of hard consciousness, that there is a mind which is non-physical, that is the driver of the car, and that the driver is receiving his, whatever, information from all the lights and dials that are provided by the mental car, so to speak. In terms of mind versus brain, it is interesting that it appears that mental symmetry can be used to analyze both, and so it is possible to postpone the question of distinguishing between mind and brain when working with mental symmetry. Reference 7, we will look at that in a moment, a function of how the basal ganglia works, which I suggest relates to exhorter and contributor thought. Reference 8 and 9 are interesting because they support a basic attitude taken by mental symmetry. Because mental symmetry looks at the mind in terms of interacting cognitive modules. So, reference 8 by Parkinson says that the right parietal region, which we associate with perceiver content, contains a spatial map, a temporal map, i.e. connecting together different experiences that are separated by time, and a social map, i.e. connecting different people and their social distance and relationship. So we have the same part of the brain dealing with different types of maps, which is supporting the idea of cognitive modules, that perceiver thought deals with all types of connections, whether they are small connections, big connections, personal connections, factual connections, and that's supported by this paper. Similarly, another recent paper noticed that all forms of beauty, mathematical beauty, visual beauty, musical beauty, and moral beauty, all activated the same medial orbital frontal region. Again, notice orbital frontal dealing with the core of identity, the core of understanding, medial adding, stepping back a little and looking at the facts of personal identity, the sequences of beauty. So that's, again, consistent with the region and also with the idea that a single part of the brain is, or a single cognitive module, is dealing with many different aspects of the same type of thing. The final reference is a good general reference of neurology. It's hard to find references that don't either contain, that are middle of the road, that contain some information but not overwhelmingly technical information. I found a lot of good intermediate level information on neurology at this link. And that is the end of part 1. Thank you.